So again, thank you everyone for joining. I'd like to welcome our first speaker tonight. Her name is Áine Doran. She is a lecturer at the University of Ulster. Áine's research focuses on economic history and primarily in the areas of demography, living standards and development. She's a recipient of the Economic History Society New Researcher Award in 2021 and has authored a number of papers, including a Poor Inquiry, Poverty and Living Standards in Pre-Famine Ireland. Áine will have a presentation via PowerPoint. Áine, if you'd like to actually start that, I'd appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Yes, no problem. Thank you very much, Dolores. So hopefully everyone can see the screen. If there's any problems, let me know. So thank you very much for that introduction, Dolores.
Oh, sorry, Áine, can you expand your screen at all? Is that possible? So you're...
Is that it now?
Yes, perfect.
Yes,
Brilliant.
perfect.
Thank you very much.
Super. Thank you. We're how many years into using Zoom and it still never goes quite right. But thank you very much for that introduction, Dolores, and for organising this lecture series and inviting me along this evening. And thank you all for giving up your Thursday evening to come along and listen to us talk. So as Dolores mentioned, I'm a lecturer in economics at Ulster, but my background is I did a PhD in economics at Queen's, and that was really focusing on economic history. So part of my thesis looked at pandemics, so just the tad bit topical in recent years, but the vast majority of it was focusing on early 19th century Ireland, really focusing on pre-famine living conditions, demography, population dynamics, etc. And that's a lot of what I'm going to talk to you tonight is going to be based on that work. But before we sort of dig into sort of pre-famine conditions, as this is the first lecture in the series, I just want to set a little bit of context on the timeline in and around the famine, just in case anyone isn't totally familiar with it. So in September 1845, we have the first cases of potato blight reported in Ireland. And then by October 1845, it's estimated that about 25 to 50% of the potato crop had been lost to blight. So this initial loss is quite large, but it is to some degree manageable. So some of the potatoes that were grown would have been used for livestock consumption, etc. So it was possible to divert some of those potatoes that were usually used for animals towards human consumption. So this initial potato failure doesn't lead to the widespread distress and devastation that we later came to see. The big issues really start to be borne by the fact the following summer in 1846 that blight again strikes the potato crop, and now about 90% of the crop is lost. And it's from the summer of 1846 onwards that we really start to see the distress hit during the famine. Things maybe look a bit more optimistic in the summer of 1847. People start to think, oh, maybe the famine is over because the blight is absent. There's no cases of blight reported. But the problem is the actual potato crop that was planted was extremely small. So because we had these crop losses in 1845 and 1846, and we had this huge reduction in food supply, a lot of people in desperation had eaten their seed potatoes. So the actual crop that was planted in 1847 was very small. So even though there's no blight, the actual crop that's retained is extremely small. And 1847 is the year that goes on to be known as Black 47, because this is the year where we see the peak in the famine death rate. And then in 1848 to 50, we see blight returning to various degrees. Then just to sort of set the population loss in context. So approximately 1 million people die and a further million emigrate during the famine, which is equating to about 25% of the Irish population at the time. And just to put that sort of death rate of 12% in context, it makes the Irish famine of the 1840s the second most deadly famine that has occurred in sort of modern history, second only to a famine that took place 100 years previously, also in Ireland. So when you're comparing the death rate experienced in the Irish famine to lots of other famines, the Irish death rate is much, much higher than we see recorded in the vast majority of other famines. So now to sort of set the scene and give a bit of context on what pre-famine Ireland was like, it's very hard to have a discussion about pre-famine Ireland without thinking about poverty. So I don't think you can overestimate the extent to which pre-famine Ireland was an extremely poor place. We have lots of contemporary accounts from travellers and official commissions that talk about the extent of Irish poverty. So we have a quote here that talks about a place where human nature was degraded to the lowest state of misery. We have commissions that find the lowest living standards in Europe. So Ireland was an extremely poor place. Poverty basically characterised or surmised pre-famine Ireland. At the time, Ireland is part of an economic union with Britain, but we do see a real divergence or gap in conditions between the two. So income per capita in Ireland is about half the rate it was in Britain. The Irish economy is very dominated by agriculture, but agricultural labourers are earning approximately half of what their counterparts in England did, and they're also experiencing a higher rate of falling wages than their counterparts in England were. About 2/5 of families are living in bedroom houses, or maybe one-room houses is in some cases a more appropriate description. And we have lots of reports of people unable to attend school or church due to a lack of clothing. So it's either no clothing at all or essential rags that mean they can't attend school or church. And we also see signs of real growing inequality between the upper and lower classes across Ireland as well. And there's some researchers who would trace the roots of Irish poverty back to the system of occupation and land ownership in Ireland. However, it's not all negative, and pre-famine Irish do present somewhat of a paradox in that in some measures they actually do surprisingly well given their financial and economic living conditions. So they're found to have literacy rates higher than would be expected given their income levels. They have a real height advantage compared to their counterparts in Britain and across Europe. And height is something it's sometimes used in history to measure living standards. It can be somewhat of a controversial measure. It's not a measure without issues, but there's no denying the fact that the Irish were, given the fact they were extremely poor, were also a very tall population, which doesn't necessarily match up with the poverty you would expect to see given the poverty. This health of the Irish is also reflected in the fact they experience really low disease rates compared to other countries in Europe at the time, and they also have much lower mortality rates than you would expect. So despite being economically and financially very poor, in some aspects, they go against that and look as though physically they're very, very healthy. And in addition to these traveller reports that talk about, the lowest state of misery, you also have traveller reports saying you'll never see a woman more beautiful than an Irish woman. And it's this real juxtaposition of people barely able to clothe themselves in rags, but looking physically extremely healthy. And this can somewhat be explained by the potato. So we know the Irish love a spud. We know at the heart of the famine, it all comes down to the loss of the potato. But I don't think people appreciate the extent to which the potato dominated life in Ireland before the famine. So much like we say poverty was a defining feature, so was the reliance on the potato. So Ireland comes to be dominated by the lumper potato. So it was an extremely cheap potato to grow and could also be grown in quite small patches of land and quite poor quality land. So the ironic thing about Ireland is actually lots of the soil is not suitable to growing potatoes, but for the lumper that didn't matter. It was a very cheap potato that could be grown in any sort of ground, and you could get relatively good yields from quite small patches. So it started to become quite an attractive crop to grow, and it starts to dominate agriculture because it's so cheap. It keeps costs down, and because of this dominance in agriculture, it doesn't really present farmers, etc., with any incentive to innovate or look at alternative crops, etc., to grow. Because it's so cheap and easy to grow and can be grown in small patches of land, it doesn't just dominate agriculture, it then starts to feed into dominating the diet as well. And of that 8 million population, approximately 3 million people were wholly dependent on the potato for their food. So their diet was potato, water, and nothing else. And even for the other 5 million of the population, for the large majority of them, the vast bulk of their diet is potatoes. So it's potatoes, maybe some milk, maybe small quantities of 1 or 2 other food sources, but by and large, it's all potatoes. And just to put in context how much potatoes people were eating, for some people you could be looking in the region of 10 to 12 pounds of potatoes a day. So if you think about the big bag of spuds you can drive to your shop and buy, an individual was eating 1 of those bags a day, and that was equating to, you know, anywhere in the region of about 4,000 calories a day that they were getting from the potato. And the real uniqueness of the potato is that it's the only single food source, when eaten alone, no other food sources there that can sustain life. So if there's any other food source and you were to only eat that food source, it wouldn't sustain your life, but the potato does. It's got a high calorie content and high nutrient and vitamin content. So even though it's the only food source a lot of the population are eating, it's providing them a really healthy diet. And that's why we see these low disease, low mortality rates, why we see a very physically healthy population. And it also starts to contribute to higher fertility rates as well. So this potato dominance and dependence starts to feed in to the population dynamics of pre-famine Ireland as well. So between 1740s and the onset of the Great Famine, it's estimated that the population quadrupled, reaching a peak of just over 8 million people. And as we've already touched on, that population during the famine falls by 25%. So 1 million die, 1 million emigrate. And then what some people don't realise is that it actually continued to fall for a further 100 years. And even today, the population of the island of Ireland as a whole has never reached the level it was pre-famine. And given this high population loss experienced during the famine and the population loss that continued to happen for 100 years after, some people have argued that Ireland was overpopulated. It had a population that it couldn't sustain, and that the famine was a check on that population. And this comes back to the idea of Malthusian population theory. Now, this is something that was very much contested or debated at the time of the famine and in the wake of the famine, and is still contested and debated to this day, of the question of, was Ireland overpopulated? So this is just sort of graphically giving you an idea of the extent of that population growth pre-famine, and then the fall post-famine, comparing that, you know, very rapid increase in Ireland and then very substantial fall to the quite smooth, steady upward trend experienced by Europe. So then this is where my research starts to come in. Up until now, we've been looking very much at the conditions in Ireland as a whole or in an aggregate. Where I start to bring my research in is looking a bit deeper than that. So basically all of the work I've done on Ireland has been inspired by this map. And what this map is showing is parish level population change between 1841 and 1851. So essentially the impact of the famine. So the darker the colour, the greater the population loss. And if we were to look at this in sort of a provincial or county level, you're seeing that traditional story of the West suffering more. But if you look down more at the parish level, you see that there's actually a bit more variation than some people might realise. And you can see clusters of neighbouring parishes where one parish maybe only has a relatively small population loss and its neighbouring parish has a much larger population loss. So after seeing this map, I started to think, well, is there differences in living conditions or conditions on the ground in these parishes that might explain why we see, you know, such variation in the impact of the famine between parishes, even though the parishes might be quite close to each other? So thankfully, there is a source that was able to provide this information to me, or give me some information on what parish level conditions were like. And that was the Irish Poor Inquiry that was carried out between 1833 and 1836. So we've talked about Irish poverty and how extreme it was. And at the time it was starting to become of concern to the British government. And there was a couple of reasons behind this. So one was that due to the poverty in Ireland. People were migrating from Ireland to England in search of support. So Irish poverty was starting to become somewhat of an English problem. And then in 1832, a new poor law had been set up in England and Wales, and there'd been an inquiry into poverty carried out there in order to set up the poor law. And the government wanted to set up a similar poor law in Ireland. So they were also going to carry out an inquiry into Irish poverty with the aim of setting up this poor law in Ireland. So there were a couple of different methodologies they used in the inquiry. One was that they sent surveys out to priests and landowners in parishes across Ireland, surveying them on the conditions of the poor in their parish. And when we're talking about the poor in a parish, we're talking about the vast majority of people within the parish. They also had commissioners that went off and visited the parishes and held oral hearings where people could come along and talk about, their day-to-day life and day-to-day conditions. And the government were very conscious of potential political or religious issues that might be experienced on the ground in Ireland, and didn't want, those issues to maybe create biases in the inquiry. So they made sure that commissioners travelled in pairs, one British, one Irish, to essentially balance out any potential biases or issues that might come up. So of the surveys that were sent out, about 1,600 of the returns of these surveys are printed in the inquiry's report. And I've gone into those surveys and tried to sort of dig out some data to understand what conditions were like across parishes. The really interesting thing about the inquiry is that their recommendations were rejected by the government. So after carrying out this survey of poverty in Ireland, the inquiry came back and said, we don't think a system of compulsory relief, a workhouse system like is in England, is suitable to Ireland. We think a system of assisted migration, investment in agriculture and infrastructure would be much more appropriate for Ireland. But the government essentially want to implement a very similar system as to what's already in England and Wales into Ireland. So they reject the findings of the inquiry and commission a new inquiry to go off and find more favourable results. So I always think that's quite an interesting counterfactual to think about of, well, what happens if the initial recommendations had been followed. So this is just sort of an idea of what those returns would look like as they're printed in the inquiry. So at the top, you have the name of the parish, their population, name of the respondent, and then their answers to some of the questions. And you can see there's real variation between respondents. Some give very short to the point answers and some like to go into a lot more detail. But it's these responses that I've gone through to try and dig out some data on. So what does it tell us? So what does this per inquiry tell us about conditions on the ground in parishes before the famine takes place? So we get lots of different insights based on the questions. So we get a great insight to the variation in the cost of living across parishes. So one of the questions asked was, what can an average labourer expect to earn as their daily wage? And on average, they're reporting a wage of about 9p a day. Now, we do see lots of the returns saying that this wage differs between winter and summer. And then we see within the responses a huge range between parishes. So some parishes are reporting a daily wage as low as 4p a day and others as high as 16p a day. So we're seeing huge variation. And those sort of high or low wages aren't concentrated in, particular regional or geographic areas. You're seeing some quite low wage parishes relatively close to high wage parishes as well. Then we also get an insight into the use of female and child labour. So there's a question on, are there employment opportunities for women and children in your parish? If so, what do they earn? You can see women earn less than men, children earn less than women, but also again, that huge variation in what the average wage is across parishes. Then we also get a bit of an insight into the annual cost of food and the annual rent that people are paying. And again, the big thing coming out is this huge variation in responses and costs across parishes. We also get insight into the daily diet. So one of the questions respondents were asked is, what is the daily diet of the poor in your parish? Unsurprisingly, 100% of parishes reported potatoes formed part of the daily diet. Just under 70% said milk was consumed regularly. Then we dropped down to about a third of parishes had fish in their diet, and about a quarter had oatmeal, and the vast majority of parishes consuming oatmeal were concentrated in or around Ulster. But then in terms of bread, eggs, butter, meat, it's very, very, very small proportion of parishes which are eating these in any way of a regular basis. And then just under 20% are reporting that potatoes are the only thing eaten on a regular basis. So for about 20% of parishes, it's potatoes, water, nothing else. But then for a very large portion of the remaining parishes, their diet is pretty much potatoes and milk and very little else added in. We also get some other insights. So there's a question on the quality of clothing, and over half of parishes are reporting their clothing quality to be bad, although there is variation in the extent of how bad this is. Some parishes, say it's poor quality, quite coarse material, and other parishes, they respond that it's essentially rags and can barely be constituted as clothing. Interestingly, nearly 50% of responses talk about emigration taking place. So one of the questions was, in the last 3 years, has migration taken place from your parish? If so, how many and where to? So I think a lot of people think of the Irish emigration starting as a result of the famine, but it was already underway before the famine had taken place. And this isn't just emigration to England. We see lots of responses talking about emigration to America and Canada as well. There was a question of how people supported themselves when out of employment. So even though there are employment opportunities and we hear, wages people can be expected to earn, they're not necessarily in employment for the full year. So they were asked, how do people maintain themselves when out of employment or when they're in hardship? About 60% say that the poor were maintained by their holdings, which essentially meant a small plot of land or a little garden at the side of their house where they were growing potatoes. So about 60% of respondents were supported by holdings of potatoes when they were out of work. 10% responded that they relied on begging. And then there's also instances of use of pawnbrokers and credit. So pawnbrokers before the famine were very widespread across Ireland, and financial institutions were also starting to develop as well. So you had your big traditional banks that were aimed at higher income classes, but you also had special financial institutions set up specifically to provide loans and credit to lower classes to try and bring them out of poverty. So the financial infrastructure was maybe more developed than some people realised. Then along with payment of wages in cash, we also see reports of people having their rent paid in lieu of work or being given a plot of land or provisions in return for work that they've done. And we've talked about that big growth in population. That growth was very visible on the ground within parishes. About 90% of parishes reported that they had seen a visible increase in their population in the last 15 years. I think this response that I've highlighted, I think is quite good at summarising the extent of the poverty that some parishes were facing. So this is taken from a parish in County Galway, and it's in response to a question on the quality of food or their diet and clothing. So we can see they're responding here. It's not just that they're only eating potatoes, they're even commenting that they're very bad potatoes. They have pigs and poultry, but they're not used for food consumption. They're used to trade or for the purchase of other goods, such as soap, paying their rent, etc. They talk about animal food, or essentially meat, is never eaten with the exception of Christmas Day if they can get it. We talk about the clothing is wretched. There's people that aren't able to attend service on Sundays due to lack of clothing. And then we also see sort of this paradox coming through again, where they're talking about people in their parish can't attend church because of lack of clothing, but it also talks about how healthy the parishioners are as well. So we're seeing that paradox of poverty but health coming through. For my research, probably one of the most important questions was relating to, well, was the poverty increasing? So respondents were asked, since 1815, have the conditions of the poor in your parish improved, deteriorated, or remained the same? And if we think of that as just a binary, they've either deteriorated or not deteriorated, we see it sort of roughly a 50-50 split. So about half of parishes have reported that their conditions have gotten worse, and about half have said they've either stayed the same or improved. And those are just plotted on this map here. And again, we're not seeing any real strong geographical patterns coming through. We're seeing neighbouring parishes having very different experiences. So I then use all of this data that I've collected to try and understand, well, what was contributing to increasing poverty. So I do some econometric analysis, and I'll not go into the details of any of that because no one needs to be hearing about that on a Thursday evening, but I'll just summarize some of the findings that I get from that. So trying to find out what was contributing to increasing poverty or deteriorating conditions. And I find that it was poor parishes that were becoming poorer were having this growing inequality. Parishes that reported oatmeal was part of their daily diet were about 25% less likely to report increasing poverty. And while population density was correlated with increasing poverty, increasing population wasn't correlated with increasing poverty. So if Ireland was overpopulated, you would expect to see that population contributing to deteriorating living conditions, but we're not seeing that correlation coming through on a parish level. Then perhaps the more interesting question is, well, how do these parish level pre-famine conditions contribute or correlate to the famine and the impact of the famine? So what I do is I take all of these data about wages, diet, all of these different characteristics about the parishes, do some analysis and see if they contributed to the extent of the population loss that that parish experienced as a result of the famine. And what I find is that increasing poverty isn't correlated with famine severity. So those parishes which said they were having deteriorating conditions don't suffer a higher population population loss as a result of this. But what does matter is absolute poverty. So I measured absolute poverty as the proportion of fourth class housing in a parish. And what I find, higher proportion of fourth class housing, higher population loss during the famine. What some people might find interesting is those parishes that reported that their diet was potatoes and nothing else aren't more vulnerable to the famine. They don't suffer higher population losses as a result. But do keep in mind, while that might seem a bit shocking, even for parishes where they were eating other foodstuffs, the potato was still the main part of their diet. Unsurprisingly, parishes where they were using their holdings as support have higher population losses. So essentially, parishes which were using potatoes to get them through periods of difficulty, when the potato fails, they don't have that means of support. And so you see higher population losses there. One of the more interesting results coming out is about the protection that maybe was or wasn't offered by alternative food sources. So we can see those parishes where the poor had oatmeal in their diet, fish in their daily diet, etc. And that offers very, very limited protection. Of all of the other diet sources, the only one which was found to have a significant effect on protecting against population loss was having fish in your daily diet, but the actual protection was very, very small. So it was only protecting against about a 1% population loss. But I think it's really important to keep in mind the potato was dominating that diet. It was providing a very high calorie diet. So even when there were other food sources available, they weren't matching up to that calorie and nutrient diet that they had been used to given the potato. Again, I'm not really seeing a relationship coming through between pre-famine population increases and famine severity. So at least at parish level, it doesn't seem like we're having this relationship between population increasing or population pressure and famine impact. And then one of the biggest results that came out of my analysis was that location really matters. So the further a parish was from either the coast or navigable waterways such as canals, the bigger their population loss. So it's roughly every 23 kilometres you move away from either the coast or waterways, it's equating to about a 3 to 4% population loss. So it's quite significant if you were to add that up. It's not necessarily something I can give a definitive answer on now as to why that happens. It's something that I'm carrying out further research on to try and get an idea of what the mechanisms behind that might be. And then the final thing I'll touch on very, very briefly in terms of context for the famine is just a little bit on political context. So I think to understand the famine, have discussions around the famine and think of the impacts and things that happened, we do have to be aware of the political context as well to place the famine in context. So the prevailing school of thought at the time was that governments should not intervene in markets. This was the economic theory that really dominated at the time. Governments shouldn't intervene in markets. Markets were efficient and they would lead to the most efficient allocation of resources. Governments shouldn't be intervening in them by trying to affect the supply of goods, etc. Public work schemes had been used before as forms of famine relief or in dealing with periods of harvest failure. They'd been successful in dealing with this before, but generally they were dealing with harvest failures on a much more regional scale and not on the national scale experienced in Ireland. There was a financial crisis and subsequent recession experienced in Britain in 1847, which resulted in the Chancellor bringing in cuts to public spending, which also meant cuts to famine relief. And there was this ingrained belief in the population that poverty was a local responsibility, not a national responsibility. So during the famine, you have cases of people migrating out of Ireland in search of relief. They end up in Liverpool and other port cities. Liverpool then calls on Westminster to provide support. They say this is a national emergency. Westminster's response is that poverty relief is a local issue, not a national issue. And the response from Liverpool and other cities that had taken them in was, well, if it's a local issue, doesn't fall on us. If it's a local issue, then it falls on Irish landowners, etc. And they're the people that should be paying for this support. And I think that ideology or thinking really falls back to the fact that in England and Wales, yes, you have the new poor law come in 1832, but you had the old poor law previously, which can date as far back as the 1600s. And that was very much ingrained that people were paying into support schemes in their local parishes. And when you did have harvest failures or periods of poverty, it was the parish that provided the support. The support didn't come through on national levels. And that's where this sort of ingrained belief is coming from. So just to wrap up with some key takeaways. So I think to keep in mind for all of the presentations that are going to come out through the rest of this series and any discussions around the famine, it's always important to remember the context of pre-famine Ireland. So it was an extremely poor place, but there is that paradox there of the extremely economically and financially poor people, but the fact that physically they were much better off than you might anticipate, that they had maybe better education rates, etc., than you might expect. You cannot overestimate the extent to which the potato dominated life in Ireland. It was right there at the centre. And I think you really have to keep in mind the really high calorie and really nutritious diet that this was providing the Irish people, and the fact that the other food sources that remained available, the other food sources that were imported in to try and provide support, couldn't match up to that calorie content that they were used to or that nutrition content that they were used to. There is growing inequality in Ireland at the time, and there is that substantial variation in condition between parishes, which I don't think we had always appreciated the extent to which we have this variation on the ground. Immigration was becoming part of the Irish story even before the famine had taken place, but there's no denying the fact the famine spread up or fast-tracked the extent of which that immigration was happening. At a localised level, the work I do and the Poor Inquiry doesn't necessarily support the idea that Ireland was overpopulated or that the population pressure contributed to the famine, or the severity of the famine, but I definitely wouldn't totally say that I wouldn't come out and say that it's definitely not a case. It might have been playing a role on a more nationalised level and you just didn't see it play down at a local level as much. Location matters when we think about the severity of the famine, and it's something I think further research is needed on before we can say exactly why. But I think the most important thing to take away is that context is important and context matters, and that anytime we're having discussions around the famine, just keep all of that context in mind. And then the final thing I will leave you with is just a couple of reading recommendations if anyone wants to know more about the famine on top of everything that will be covered in the series. So there's a book published actually just in the last sort of week or so called The Death Census of Black 47, Eyewitness Accounts of Ireland's Great Famine. And I think it's still available online free, and I think you can get it for free on Kindle as well. And it's a great read and very accessible as well. Anything by Cormac O'Grada, I definitely recommend. He is sort of the godfather of Irish economic history and any research on the Irish famine. His books may have a little bit of econometrics in them, but they're easy to skim through. So if econometrics and data isn't your thing, don't let that put you off. And then maybe a bit of an older book, but one that is still highly recommended, The Great Hunger by Cecil Woodham Smith. But I'll leave it there. Hopefully, for at least some of you, that will have been interesting. You might have learned something you didn't know about pre-famine Ireland, and it might provide a bit more context for the presentations going forward. But I'll stop sharing my screen. I'm happy to take any comments or questions that might come up, and if people later on want to contact me about anything, that's absolutely fine as well.
Thank you very much, Áine. That was a great presentation. Just before I go through a few questions that have been submitted, I just want to mention to everybody, we also have another speaker, Dr. Gerard McAtasney, who has written extensively in the famine, and he will be actually joining us in this discussion. I'll give you a little bit further background on Gerard later on. Áine, can I just go through a few questions that have been submitted?
Yes.
Firstly, one was, is there famine comparison statistics with Asian nations available? So the famine in Ireland and comparison statistics with times of hunger in Asian nations.
Yeah, so in the table I showed at the start, comparing Irish famine to some other famines, there is a much longer version of that table available. I just sort of picked the higher death rate famine. So it's a much longer version of that table, and there are Asian famines contained within that. But in terms of percentage population loss, they're much smaller than what you see during the famine. Now, there's your, pre-industrial, long time ago in history famines that we don't necessarily have the exact data on, but in terms of modern famines that we have data in terms of the death rate on, the Irish famine is still coming out, near right at the top.
Thank you. Did landowners object to the poor law? Do you know?
Yeah, so there was definitely lots of controversy when the idea of the Irish landowners having to fund the famine support and poor support, it was something that they were definitely not on board with. And I think it came down to those sort of institutional differences between the system in Britain and Ireland, whereas, they were used to, in Britain, paying the taxes, etc., to the local parishes or local poor unions to fund the support. It wasn't something that was traditional in the Irish system, so there was obviously objections to having to do that. I think the idea that poverty is a local issue, not a national issue, isn't one that was felt in Ireland. So the landowners didn't necessarily have that feeling of, well, we should be paying to fund it and support it. So there was definitely objections to the idea of the poor law being brought in, and particularly when the idea that the funding of famine relief should ultimately be transferred to Irish landowners, etc. There was definitely objections and exceptions to that.
Oh, thank you. Is the Poor Law Inquiry Report available online, or where could it be sourced if someone wanted to?
Yeah, so it is online. I'll say it's a couple of thousand pages long, and it's not a very interesting read, so I wouldn't recommend it. So it is online through the British Parliamentary Papers, and it's, if you are looking for it, Appendix C is the one where you see all of the reports being published. You could also do a little Google search. There is a book that was written about the Poor Inquiry that maybe gives you a better overview of the responses and the detail in it without having to try and read through those, in some cases, quite poorly scanned responses. So yes, it is available online to read, but it's not something I would recommend.
Okay.
It's not an easy read.
I just want to mention here, someone has asked, can they get a copy of your PowerPoint? I'll just remind everybody that I will be forwarding the link to this recording to everyone who's been in attendance. So you'll be able to access it through that. And can I just ask, what is the definition of a fourth class housing? You mentioned fourth class housing in your talk. What would that definition be, or
So,
how many grades of housing was there?
So generally there
housing?
was sort of the 3 grades, and the fourth class would have been the lowest. So that is sort of the idea that you might have seen portrayed in, you know, TV series, etc., around the famine. Or I think there's one down in the front of University of Cork. It's essentially a mud hut that doesn't necessarily have windows, doesn't really have rooms. It's the most basic of houses. It can only just be called a house, essentially.
It's a form of shelter, a very basic shelter, really.
Yeah.
Thank you, Áine. Someone also made a comment here in relation to, you were discussing this question maybe in relation to the impact of the famine and the population proximity to water. So, for example, from the coast. And as some people listening tonight will be aware, Lurgan, which is within Armagh, Bambridge, Craigavon Borough Council area, is located only a short few miles from Lough Neagh, which is one of the largest freshwater sources, inland lakes in Europe, or certainly on this island or the UK. So does that contradict some of the statements you made, or is it a case where, because of the poverty, lacks of skills, lack of monetary resources, that people just, even if they had easy access to water, they couldn't have actually fished? This would also apply to likes of the west coast of Ireland or likes of Skibbereen, where I suppose if you don't have the tools, maybe it's just not feasible either. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so when I'm talking about the water, I largely mean the coast and waterways such as canals and rivers. So it's not necessarily the likes of Lough Neagh, although there will obviously be a lot of those rivers, etc., feeding into the lough. I think part of it, so you're not going to see that effect for every single parish that's close to water. So some of it might be that, you know, the poverty is so extreme. The other factors, you know, the absolute level of poverty, so say the fourth class housing, etc., that is outweighing any benefit that the water might bring, so they don't have those tools for fish, etc. The water effect may also be coming through the access to trade that it might have offered, and that's something that I want to dig into in future research. So it could be a case that there are some parishes that were located close to the water but didn't necessarily have trade networks from that, whereas there might be other parishes who were, you know, close to coastal port towns or had trade along the river, and that was providing a form of financial support. So there's definitely more work needed to dig in to try and understand if access to water or access to waterways was offering some form of support as to what exact mechanisms that was working in.
Okay, thank you. Another question is how much of the difference between England and Ireland in terms of attitude to poor law support could have been due to Irish landlords not being part of the local population? Now, I just kind of want to say, Jared, if you have a comment here, please do kind of step in as well to any of these questions. But can you comment on that, Áine or Jared?
If Jared wants to jump in on that one, that's absolutely fine, because I'll be honest and say it's not something
No problem.
that I've necessarily looked into too much.
Jared, would you have any comment on that?
What was the question again?
How much of the difference between England and Ireland in terms of attitude to poor law support could have been due to Irish landlords not being part of the local population?
I think local study research throws up a very mixed picture. And one of the things that jumps out from all the letters that go to the Relief Commission, which forms the backbone of a lot of research carried out in the, say, mid-1990s up until the early 2000s. A lot of the comment is on the absenteeism, the evils of absenteeism, and there'll be a quote directly relating to that in one of my passages later on. And they talk about the fact that not only could landlords, if they'd been resident, provided the economic wherewithal to help their people, but it was to be able to set an example. It was that paternalism which was missing. Mostly this is written by Protestant clergymen of the time. But you did have landlords, for example, Lord Leitrim, who owned vast estates in Donegal, Leitrim and Kildare. He was an absentee, but he actually lived in Ireland. He lived in Kildare. But there's no two ways about it that the vast majority of them didn't live locally. And the fact that one of the aspects that I've been looking at over the last few years is the shutting down of the Dublin Parliament and all that went with that, and how that then contributed to the increase in poverty of the country. That everything went then towards London, and Dublin became really, well, not poor, but certainly lost its prestige as a capital of the country. And everything was directed towards London. So the whole, the landlords and everything that went with them just went over the water. But it's a very complex picture. In Armagh, for example, Lord Gosford went out of his way to help his tenants through various methods: drainage, giving out money, giving out food. There's actually a huge volume in the National Library in Dublin, and it was kept on the Lord Leitrim's estate in Mohill. And it is a huge, it's maybe 1,000 pages, and it's every single day from about 1835 to 1852 or 53. Notes are taken of the work that's done on the estate throughout every single day throughout those years. Now, this is the Lord Leitrim who was later assassinated in the 1870s in County Donegal. And he's actually, if people are sick in November 47, going into 1848, right, he's given out money despite the fact they're not able to come to work. He's giving out food, he's supplying them with clothes, etc. So it's a very complex picture. It isn't a case of, you know, every landlord was bad. Some landlords had a tendency to be close to their tenants, but they were the ones who were more likely to have been resident, the likes of Gosford, the likes of Shardmont, etc. Whereas the vast majority, certainly in the research I've done, seem to have been absent and not contributing to the needs of their tenants. And in fact, it's mentioned in Donegal that they're happy to withdraw thousands of pounds of rent each year and give nothing back to the tenants. And these are people who wouldn't be, as we would term it today, anti-establishment. These were Protestant Church of Ireland clergymen, and they were making these comments. So but it is a mixed picture. But by and large, I think the questioner has a good point there, that they were foreign in terms of their attitude and also where they lived.
And some of that we may actually touch on again in some of the other lectures in future nights as well, I think, because there always is a crossover on topics slightly. Just want to mention here, were landlord returns on land higher here than in England or Scotland? Would we be aware of that? Would you know that, Jared? Sorry, that's fine. Just want to mention. And also, someone actually mentioned about the maps. Some of the maps you'll have seen in Áine's presentation. I believe, Áine, you may have sourced them from a book called The Atlas of the Great Famine. Would I be right?
So the couple of maps I showed, there's probably a version quite similar to the
very
Parish
similar, yes.
one. Yeah, in the Atlas, and then the other one I had created myself.
Certainly, if people wanted to see a book with some great maps which reflect the whole island, I would recommend a book called The Atlas of the Great Irish Famine. I could actually send people details on it. Actually, Jared actually contributed to part of that book, and I will put that in an email at a later date. It's a very large book, relatively expensive, but certainly a fantastic resource. And such a good book, actually, the council will be providing all secondary schools within our borough a number of copies of that book as an educational resource. Another question, I know, I'm sorry, I'm conscious people may want a bit of a comfort break, but something else someone mentioned was family discussion and young people been taught about the famine in Ireland currently or previously. And I think myself, Áine and Jared may all have be able to add to this comment. I'm presuming maybe that question came from one of our international guests attending tonight. The way the famine is taught, I would believe, as someone who attended the education system in the Republic, it's something that's been visited a lot more recently. I would believe with any kind of trauma that impacts the society, the trauma is so severe that the famine is actually not talked about, and certainly was not talked about. Personally, I would have had a grandparent who was born shortly after the famine, but and I would have actually asked my own parents about this, and there was the famine was a period in our history not talked about. I suppose the experience was so traumatic. Certainly more recent years, the famine is talked about a lot more in the education setting. And here in Northern Ireland, it has definitely been talked about more too. I think it's important that we get more education materials relevant to our local areas, to our schools, to actually facilitate that discussion. Council, with the help of Jared, has recently developed an education booklet, which I will share with all those who have registered for the series. This education booklet is a brief synopsis on the impact of the famine, but also contains a lot of relevant information to the impact of the famine within Armagh, Banbridge, Craigavon area. And we felt that this was important so young people in their young teens studying the famine in school could actually relate a little bit to the impact locally, rather than a lot of the textbooks would talk about the famine in relation maybe to the west of Ireland or to the Republic. But I certainly will circulate that to everyone attending, and we'll be circulating that to all our secondary schools and primary schools in the borough in the coming weeks. So I hope that helped a little bit in relation to answering that. But Áine and Jared, you also might want to comment on that about kind of family discussion and the impact of the famine, if you wish at all.
Well, I think the historiography prior to the 1990s was very, very poor. There was a book emerging in the 1950s, which was very much what's termed revisionist history. It was very dry. There was no attempt to ascertain the reasons behind the British government policy, and also the culpability question was strictly avoided. And I think there are a number of reasons why then over the last 30 years or so it has become such an important subject, and that, you know, people in the 1950s, local history, 1960s, it didn't exist. Very, very rare when you find a local history book. People then becoming more educated, education for the masses, was the Education Act in the North from 1947 onwards, that more people are able to access resources, online resources now, of course, and local history then became very, very interesting. You know, I'm sure Áine's the same, that, you know, it's, if you're giving a lecture, you could find some fella sitting half asleep, and then you mention his townland and he jumps up and his eyes are wide open and he's familiar, suddenly he's interested in the lecture because it relates to his area. The sesquicentenary from 1995 onwards saw a deluge of publications, all based, well, not all, but the vast majority based around local impact. And certainly my first work was on Lurgan, and it wasn't a case of looking at this subject as a whole. It was this amazing, I suppose, this catastrophe that happened in the mid-19th century. How did it have an effect on my area? That's all I was interested in. It was the same for so many other people. The downside of that was, I suppose, that people just flocked to the standard resource, which was Relief Commission papers in the National Archives in Dublin, and neglected then other material which is available, which sheds a much greater and deeper insight into the impact from 1845 right through to 1852 or 53. But it was avoided, and there were, you know, economic historians writing in the 1970s and 80s with an agenda, and this has been debated, that, you know, if you took a certain perspective on the famine, then that reflected your political loyalties one way or another. If you sought to blame the British state and support John Mitchell, well then that reflected your perspective on the Troubles in the North, for example. Now, that has been written about extensively. So people actually were afraid and shied away from it. Whereas now there's such a vast amount of sources that, as we say, it's not black and white. There's loads of grey areas. It's a very nuanced subject. And by recognizing that and approaching it from a research perspective, where you're saying, I'm not going into this to establish X, Y, and Z. I just want to see what happened. I think, you know, and over the last 30 years, the subject has just bloomed, has blossomed because of the amount of people involved, the variety of subjects, the perspectives, economics, politics, demography, gender, etc., that are involved in it, that make it such a fascinating subject.
And
You know,
I think, sorry, go ahead, Áine.
Just because I absolutely agree with everything Jared has said. In terms of famine research, the field is relatively new. When you think, you know, it's this huge event in Irish history, and the vast majority of the research on it is really only, you know, 30 years or less older, because it was avoided, and there, you know, people avoided it for reasons of the whole question of blame and not wanting to be viewed, you know, one side or the other, and because of the controversy around it. So lots of people, you know, didn't want to carry out the research. I know, you know, coming back to your point, Dolores, that you were making about people not talking about it because of the trauma, etc., etc. I know, you know, coming up to the sort of 75th anniversary, so the 75th or 100th anniversary, the Irish government had a big push, recognising that the people that were either born just after the famine or had survived, or the next generation, they were eventually going to die out, and there was all this information that we'd lose out on. So they had a big push to try and gather up some of the oral history, and there wasn't a huge uptake on that because people didn't want to talk about it. But we are, you know, the last 30 years or so are seeing, you know, the rate of research increasing and increasing and increasing. We're going beyond looking at that national picture and digging in down to those local levels, which I think is what is really needed, because yes, the national picture is the starting point, but because of all of that variation that existed, we do need to dig down a bit deeper, and digging in a bit deeper hopefully stimulates the conversations or facilitates the conversations taking place as well.
Thank you, Áine. And I know we will visit that topic again, as I said earlier, in other lectures later. Just quickly, one last question, please, if that's okay, because conscious of time, before we have a comfort break. Is it true that most of the crops that had been harvested in the years had been exported over to England? And if landlords could have helped the population more? Jared, do you want to comment on that?
Well, it's not true that they're all exported. Lots of food was consumed within the country, but food was exported, and I'd be giving examples at a local level where the papers are criticising the fact that in the midst of such a catastrophe, that food has been exported. Also, attacks were made, and we often hear this, and a lot of the debate is framed on what happened in the West and the South. In fact, we find attacks being made on ships exporting potatoes to Scotland from the Portadown area in 1847. So it's not true that all food was exported, but a significant amount was, yes.
Thank you. So I think we'll take a comfort break now, if everybody's happy with that. It's now 8 o'clock Irish time. So if we'd maybe take 10 minutes, everyone, maybe grab yourself a cup of tea, coffee, and we'll come back here in kind of 10 minutes past 8. Thank you very much.
And thank you everyone for your questions and comments as well.
Áine, thank you very much.